good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's ThinkIn. My name is Liz Moseley. I'm an editor and partner here, and we are continuing today our year-long investigation into police culture, specifically the dynamics between police, people, and treatment of women, and the policing of crime that particularly affects women and girls. And for those of you who haven't been to a ThinkIn before, you're very welcome. Thanks for being here. We say a ThinkIn is a forum for civilized disagreement, so we want to hear from you. I'd love to hear your experiences, your perspectives, whether you agree or disagree. I'd like you to challenge what we're talking about tonight, because this evening's ThinkIn, as I say, I'm sort of up to my eyes in trying to understand police culture, which is a preposterously difficult thing to do from the outside. But I'm really genuinely trying to piece together something that has, in the time that we've been embarking on this project, in sort of November-ish time last year, it has been really front and centre of the news in a way that police sexism isn't always, for lots of reasons. So for those of you, I can see some of the names popping up in my participants list. I know some of you joined us last month. We had a conversation about police and social media, and we heard about how actions of police culture play out in public and online, and about tensions between what is said in public and what goes on in private. I think it was the day after that ThinkIn, the IOPC report was published that revealed the content of some horrendous WhatsApp messages exchanged between police officers based at Charing Cross Station. And then a few days later, Cressida Dick stepped down, and I observed the response of lots of police officers on social media, really in support of Cressida Dick. It wasn't universal, but lots and lots of police people really feeling that she was a really good officer and a high integrity person, a great leader, and really sort of felt that she was a victim of kind of political point scoring. And then after that, the Police Federation issued a statement saying they had no confidence in the Mayor of London. Of course, the conversation between Cressida Dick and Sadiq Khan was what prompted, in the end, precipitated her stepping down. So there is clearly a schism between what people outside the police think of the police and what a lot of people inside the police think of the police. And we're trying to understand that in the process of this investigation. And on my travels, speaking to serving and former officers and people who work with the police quite closely in various different capacities, and also ordinary members of the public who, for one reason or another, come into contact with police, I've heard a number of people tell me in various different ways, or speculate perhaps, that some of the actions that are being taken by people inside and outside, so political actions, perhaps media actions like this is, and also sort of initiatives that are born inside police forces themselves, that are specifically designed to sort of make the toxic aspects of police culture better, to sort of improve behaviour, to educate people on what isn't an acceptable way of behaving, and so on. Those actions, some of them that are meant to be making things better, are having the opposite effect and sort of causing almost like a retrenchment of attitudes. And that obviously sort of slightly made my blood run cold, not least because what we're trying to do here is an exercise in genuine understanding. And we've called the title tonight is Political Correctness Holding Back Police Reform, which is a slightly sort of, have to do a bit of mental gymnastics to understand what we're saying. Because of course, political correctness has rather fallen out of fashion as a term. It's sort of, I think, been replaced by woke as a broadly derogatory sort of bucket phrase, a catch-all word used to mean sometimes the language police, a way that people who find an agenda that's about, you know, progressive and inclusive, find some of that stuff sanctimonious and heavy-handed, or perhaps counter to what would be deemed common sense. That's a sort of label that is used for those sorts of initiatives. And I'm trying to get under the skin of why it might be, if it is true, that some of these initiatives are having the opposite effect, and therefore how we could do a better job. Because I do speak to people, police officers particularly, and you can see them on social media, you don't even need to speak to them, telling me that they've had enough, really, and that the culture change efforts, sanctimonious, heavy-handed, ultimately not really genuine, because senior people, when push comes to shove, don't care that much. And the net effect from the ordinary officers is to feel themselves to be under attack, and that this sort of fear of a misconduct charge or a complaint for the slightest slip up looms large. And somehow in the melee, the progress that we all want to make isn't being made. And I'm trying this evening to sort of get a handle on why that might be, if indeed that is the case, and what we could do differently to make things better. So as I say, please do join in. You don't have to be an expert. You could very welcome to think aloud, join in the chat, stick your digital hand up, and I'll bring in as many of you as I can. My colleague Sophie is in the chat, and she'll do her best to sort of moderate and respond to your questions. So things like, do we think police career paths reward senior people who say the right thing but do the wrong thing? Do we think that's true? Is there a schism between what police leaders say they want and what they actually want? Is it still the case that misogyny is seen as less of a problem than other forms of discriminatory behaviour? Is it that banter is just the price of police morale? Is it that you can't have one without the other? Has all the negative focus on police culture, especially in relation to misogyny, causing retrenchment? What do we know about what works when it comes to changing behaviours? And perhaps there are learnings from the police conversation that could be applied to other sorts of professional environments. To start us off this evening, I'm very grateful to Kelly Frost for being with us. Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm not going to ask Kelly to sort of tell her whole story again, not least because, well, it's long, but also it's fairly distressing. But to suffice, Kelly, you were arrested, and in a cell you were assaulted by police officers at Charing Cross Station. This was in 2011.
Yes.
And when you were having a severe episode of mental ill health yourself, and subsequently, years later, you received an apology, and the officers have been dealt with who were involved in that incident. But you sent me a note, not last weekend, the weekend before, with your reflections about banter, this word that has cropped up a lot in coverage over the last few months. And I wonder if you might just share some of those reflections on what banter is and how it shows up and what it is we're really dealing with.
Okay. So I have reflected on my reflections since then as well. And when I hear the word banter, my skin crawls. I can't use it sincerely without air quotes, but I don't know what's worse, the person who uses air quotes sincerely or the person who uses the word banter. But I spoke to a friend about it last night, what she understood by the word banter. And then she said, well, let's look it up. And I think the OED says that it mentions that it's good-natured and gentle teasing. And I thought about that, and I thought, that's not what they're doing. I think we've all been gaslit into believing that banter is something else. I think people use the behaviors and the language they use and the things they say is not gentle or good-natured. It's humiliating and cruel. And then when you complain, they say, all right, love, it's just bants, it's epic bants. So, but what they're doing is not this gentle, witty badinage between equals. I think that when I hear people say, oh, all right, love, calm down, it's just banter, it's kicking down. And in order for something to be gentle, teasing, the people who are engaged in this activity would have to be like of the same status. And so that's why I worry about this happening in a profession which is so heavily differentiated.
There's a power mismatch, isn't there?
Yes, I work in theatre, and you know, of course there are people who have more important jobs and they get paid more. But, you know, in the police and in the army and so on, you even use deferential language. You call someone sir or ma'am, or, you know, sergeant so-and-so. Like when I speak to my colleague at the theatre, I'm like, Ellie, what should I do with this fabric? Not designer Ellie, what should I do with this fabric? So I think that it's possible that I could banter with my colleagues, but I really worry that the police think that this is something that they can do between themselves on work time. And certainly it's not possible, in my opinion, to banter between a police officer and a member of the public if that member of the public is in custody, because of obviously there's a huge power imbalance there. My freedom's been taken away. I'm completely at your mercy. You can do whatever you want to me, which they did to me. The police, the officers that were involved in my abuse at the station, I can't, I mean, I know we're speaking tomorrow, Liz. I'm going to go through my notes, which is like this. It's about like 18 inches of notes and folders, but I don't think they ever used the word banter, but they certainly did try to excuse it as nothing. And I don't know if you want me, I'm quite happy to say the sort of thing they were saying about me, and then perhaps people might want to decide if they think it's gentle, witty.
I think the point you make, Ellie, is important. I actually never completed it, I'm ashamed to say. I did half a linguistics degree at Goldsmiths, where we talked a lot about political correctness as a concept and verbal hygiene as a concept, and the way that it's what is said and the context in which it's said it and who is saying it to whom are all very important aspects of how you know, the language plays, which is why you can't have a sort of a list of things you can and can't say, because it's all very variable and quite complicated. What I was particularly interested in, Kelly, about what happened to you was that there were a mixture of staff. There were senior people and more junior people that in the investigation that sort of went into the complaint that you in the end made. The younger and newer staff did express a discomfort with what was happening, but didn't feel able to sort of say, oh, that doesn't feel right to me.
Which is see, when I mean, I think I have to give a bit of background. So in the in making my complaint, which was investigated by the Department for Professional Standards, the DPS, it was investigated fully, and according to my solicitor, she's very rarely sees this level of commitment to rooting out the bad apples. It took, I think, about 15 months, and I saw all of the CCTV. So I saw what they were saying about me and how they were saying it. And I also saw how there was one of the things that hurt me so deeply is the fact that women were involved. And I feel slightly differently.
Female officers, you mean? Yes, as well as male ones. Yeah.
But their words were still, I still feel that even though there were women dishing this out to me, as well as men, I still felt that that I was a victim of male violence, even though it was carried out by some female henchmen. So right at the start, one of the female officers expresses what sounds like genuine concern for me and says, wait a second, Sarge, we better keep a close eye on this one. And he says something dismissive, and within, I'm not sure exactly how long, but it wasn't long before she was an equal participant in the name calling and the dehumanizing, the language, the derogatory language and the sexually humiliating language that they used, which achieved the dehumanization of me, which meant that they were then allowed to treat me like I was not a human. So I feel like without this bants, they wouldn't have been able, it's all part of it. If they, I didn't even have a name. I was Mrs. Mad in cell 3. I was, you know, I was the one with hairy armpits. I was like, have you seen her knickers? You know, it's obviously misogynist if they're talking about my underwear and my body hair, because they would never do that about a man. A man wouldn't be expected to wear sexy underwear on the off chance that he gets arrested and needs to, you know, needs to. I mean, I was expected to uphold beauty standards whilst having a mental health crisis and being forcibly restrained. My arms and my legs forced apart into leg restraints, wearing a vest and pants. And I was still apparently not being a good enough female because I was wearing big knickers and hadn't shaved my armpits. And I was mad. So, you know, women aren't supposed to be, we're not supposed to make noise or
there was layers for sure of sort of ideologically based. Understood.
But the female officer, she definitely set out, you could see there was genuine concern for me. But I feel from watching all the CCTV and from seeing their when we had the gross misconduct hearing and hearing what they said, I did feel that there did seem to be genuine shame and remorse expressed by a few of them. And they were the ones who did, you could see that they had attempted. And I do feel a bit sorry for them. I mean, it's not good enough because it's one of the police standards, you have to challenge inappropriate behaviour. And I'm a teacher and I have to do that. It's a safeguarding thing. If we can't do that, we can't safeguard people. So it is not good enough. And it is a misconduct. It does count as misconduct, but I couldn't help feeling a bit sorry for them that they did try. But I could see that, I just feel like from what I could see, they didn't want to be the banteree. They wanted to be the banterer.
Yeah, totally.
If you don't join them, then you'll find
yourself on the receiving end.
Yeah, I could only imagine what they would have said to her if she hadn't have joined in.
Okay, Kelly, thank you so much. And I know I can imagine the images in your mind, so I'm grateful to you for sort of playing it back to us. We've already got some really interesting contributions in the chat. I'd love to hear from Dean, and then I'm going to bring in Graham, who's an invited expert this evening, and then I'll go to Suki. Dean, you're having a sort of back and forth a little bit with Graham on banter among colleagues. Kelly's obviously describing misplaced banter between colleagues, but that very much affected a member of the public, in this case Kelly. You're making comment about early on in your career you were worried about fitting in and how that affected your judgment on what was and wasn't banter or not banter or whatever. Are we able to unmute Dean so he can say words? There we go. Should be able to hear you now.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, we can.
Yeah, I wasn't so much worried about popularity. It was just that when banter was occurring in the friendly sense of the word, I was just advised to be more concerned if I wasn't subject to that banter, because that would indicate that I probably wasn't trustworthy. And that was the point I was making, really.
Oh, okay. So if you weren't in the bantering crew, they didn't trust you. So it was a very much a sort of indication that you were part of the you've been accepted, if you like. You could be effective as part of the kind of community that you were in as a police officer if you were in the bantering crowd.
Yeah, I think so. And there was nothing extreme. It was just probably, as with any work environment, if you find yourself isolated, probably people have formed a perception of you, rightly or wrongly, and that's all I was getting at, really.
Interesting. Okay, thanks, Dean. Let's bring in Graham Goulden, who I'm very grateful to you for being here today, Graham. You were a police officer for 30 years. In which force? Police Scotland?
Yeah.
Is now and wasn't before?
Yeah, I worked up in Edinburgh, but Police Scotland came on board 2013, but I was working with the Violence Reduction Unit during those times as a chief inspector. I retired from Police Scotland in 2017.
And you have, I came across you, funnily enough, when I was lurking in a Week Ops chat, and we had sort of a representative from Week Ops on the thinking we did last month. And you now do sort of training and things around bystandership. But I guess we'll come on and talk about how that works in a second. But you also sort of were an instigator, I think, of a campaign that was run by Police Scotland that was particularly designed to encourage men to sort of call out other men for overstepping the line. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so we're coming up to that horrible anniversary of Sarah Everard's death this week, 3rd of March, I think that is. And in the weeks after that, I found myself on television a lot, speaking about the case, what I felt was needed. I'm a real believer in engaging that third person, the bystander, especially men, when it comes to the prevention of violence. Most violence in this world is committed by men against men. We look at violence, sexual violence, domestic abuse, mostly it's men as the perpetrators, girls and women as the victims. Yeah, men are victims of women's violence and other men's violence as well. And what I was really calling out for was the need for society to what I call sweat the small stuff. And what I mean by that is we as a society, we tend to put words and language in the small category. That's just small stuff. And if it's online, we just minimize it even further. And after the Sarah Everard case, I was speaking on Scottish television, and I said, what we need to be doing is we need to sweat the small stuff. We are told in society, don't sweat the small stuff, focus on the big stuff. And I remember after Sarah's death, murder, speaking, my brother was speaking to me, and he said, Graham, you're on television speaking about this. How can I stop murder and rape? And I said to my brother, I said, stop thinking about that end of the continuum and start thinking about the language and the words. Sexual violence starts long before you think it does. And on the back of that, I was approached by Police Scotland to develop the Don't Be That Guy campaign, which it went viral globally around the world. And we got some really good feedback from everybody, but in particular men. Men wrote in, emailed in, talking about how it made them think, because those first 5 seconds of the film are where most of us guys have been. We've laughed at jokes, we've told the jokes, we've been involved in that type of banter that Kelly's talking about. But thankfully, most of us don't go past that, and we don't start to get involved in things that the rest of the film talks about. But that isn't enough for me. We need men to be speaking up and understanding that the harm that causes and how it can lead to, language and jokes can lead to, if unchallenged, violence and abuse. Ervin Staub, the psychologist in the US, talks about the evolution of violence. Violence will evolve and continue until we have interruption. Not only from the people causing the harm, but also bystanders. Bystanders can quickly become complicit bystanders if things don't stop. And we've seen that. We see that in lots of incidents, and not only in policing, but in other organizations as well. So Don't Be That Guy was a campaign to start a conversation. And I feel, and most people have seen the film, but they've not gone behind in the website. The website is full of really good blogs that I've written, videos that we've got. We got the men's hockey team from the University of Edinburgh speaking about their views in the campaign. Some really positive. My view is, if we can get more men speaking about these issues and be vulnerable and talk about honestly how they feel, we will start to make a massive difference. All we're doing now is playing whack-a-mole out there. And we can play that game all day. We can play whack-a-mole all day, but we need to reduce the moles. And that's where, creating conversations, bringing men, women, and other individuals in as friends. Friends don't let friends drive drunk was the 1980s campaign from the US. But surely friends don't let friends sexually harass. Friends don't let friends use violence against another person. And if we can really focus on peer groups, we can make a difference.
Graham, I was speaking with a woman called Sarah Bray, who is with South Wales Police. She's staff, not an officer, and she's part of a national sort of policy-making team of people who are looking at new guidelines and policies for police around sexual misconduct and behaviours and stuff like that. And she's brilliant, full of energy, focused, doing really good stuff. And in what she was sharing with me about some of the work that she's been doing, she said this sentence, which was, communications campaigns aren't changing behaviour. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, given what Don't Be That Guy is a communications campaign, like you say, it's backed up by loads of other resources and things like that. but nobody thinks that they're the problem, do they? And is that a bit of an issue with the way we're going about this kind of change?
I think what we don't do enough of, my brand, Cultivating Minds, I just love creating conversations within universities, within schools, workplaces, sports teams, police departments. Because when you do that, you allow the healthy norms to rise to the surface. And the psychology, the evidence says, not the psychology says, the evidence says that you're more likely to be an active bystander when you know you have friends and allies in your work group. If you know you've got friends and allies that think the same, will support you, you're more likely to intervene in situations. So I think campaigns, rely on the visual, the strapline. For example, I believe this week the Home Office are releasing a campaign against men's violence against women and girls, and they have said there's going to be some simple to use tools, and the tools will be direct, distract, defer. The tools that we've had since the 1970s around bystander intervention. We need to do more than that. We need to actually create spaces for conversations where all of us, and men in particular, can share their healthy views. Alan Berkowitz, the psychologist, talks about most men in this world are disgusted by the likes of Harvey Weinstein, the likes of Wayne Couzens and other abusive men. But until we know what our friends think, the risk is we don't speak up. And actually, we know from the likes of Alan Berkowitz as well, is that men respect other men for challenging other men's sexist behaviour, racist behaviour, and so on. But unless we create the conversations, men are often left thinking, what do my friends really think? There's a psychology research looks it's called the destructive influence of imaginary peers, where men in particular wrongly perceive what their friends think, right? So they wrongly perceive that their friends, especially at university age, 20, 21, early 20s, they wrongly perceive what their friends think. They think that their friends support sexist views, misogynistic views. The reality is they don't. And what that leads to is the perfect storm where good men do nothing, and there's some men that cause the problems are left unchallenged. And we need to find a way to flip that narrative around so that as guys can come together and deal with this stuff. Because I think, Kelly, you used that phrase, bad apples. Personally, these are not bad apples, they're harm doers. They're causing harm to our organization, as in policing. And when we start to talk like that within organizations, that these people are causing harm to our organization, to our communities, then we've got a real good way to influence people to think differently and to act, which is what we want them to do.
Graham, I'm going to come to Suki in a second. Do you think that this sense that I've got just from, as I say, speaking to people and what have you, that what we say when we say changing attitudes, culture change, the types of things that you're talking about, what perhaps is being heard by police people who are, knackered, haven't got enough resources, under pressure all the time, doing really brutal work in the communities, feeling like it's a thankless task. All of that is true and real. Do you think that what is being heard is perhaps, are you joking? I can't now have fun with my colleagues. And that in the end, we're sort of getting further away from a solution. Does that feel like it's possible to you? Or do you think I'm a pessimist?
No, I think, I think in policing, we have good officers who want to do the right thing. And we spend our time in the last year, we spent a lot of time in speaking about officers not challenging the likes of the guys in Charing Cross or Wayne Couzens. But then we quickly go back to the harm doers, the people who are causing the harm. We need to spend more time. Cops are not trained to challenge their colleagues. You might think this is really silly, right? But we need to train our officers to be active bystanders. I work with US police on the back of George Floyd and other cases. They've developed a program called Active Bystander in Law Enforcement, which not only deals with misconduct issues, we deal with mistakes and mental health. We make it relevant to everybody. Harvard Institute says that lots of diversity programs backfire because they focus specifically on one issue: sexism, racism, homophobia. And what the evidence says is they need to make it relevant to everybody in the organization. Let's face it, cops are smashed out of the park just now when it comes to work. That's leading to compassion fatigue. It's leading to, I think, another psychological term, learned helplessness. We've got people in these teams who see the problem, but they don't know what to do, and they're learning not to intervene. Apathy is setting in. And I think, this ABLE program, Active Bystander in Law Enforcement, is training officers to deal with things that are way before we have the misconduct issue. So when that joke first appears in the canteen, we're learning to deal with it. It's about reducing harm, not only to our communities, but if I don't intervene here, could my colleague be sacked? Could they be sacked in 6 months' time because of a complaint? And that's what it's about. It's about helping officers spot things. Earliest is best, better late than never. How do we get officers to be trained? And most officers want to do the right thing, but they don't know how to. Will they be supported by their colleagues? Will they be supported by their leaders in the organization? And we can't just expect officers to speak up. We need to help them. It's like we need to help you as the people here today. There'll be some moral rebels in this world. We know there's moral rebels in the world who speak up no matter what. Yeah. But there's a lot of us who are susceptible to not intervening.
Yeah, that point you make could be the key to this, that there's a direct line from a mistake, which is definitely going to happen because everyone's human, and mental health and misconduct. And it almost feels like the designing of the solutions, the efforts, are starting the wrong way up. If you start the misconduct and try and work back, you miss the first two, and then that's maybe why it doesn't stick. I'm going to bring in Suki if I can. Sukhvinder Cohen, who is a pal of mine. I've spoken to her. Hi, Suki, nice to see you.
Hi there, Liz. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, Suki has worked. We've had a couple of good chats, and you've done 2 stints in the police force, in the Met and then the West Midlands Police, with a gap in between. But now you're going to be an investigative journalist and probably take my job. What do you were part of professional standards, I think. Was it towards the end of your working life?
No, what it was, Liz, I worked as part of the positive action team. I came from the counter-terrorism unit to positive action, part of this recruitment by Boris Johnson for 20,000 police officers. And I was specifically brought in to get West Midlands Police more into our BAME communities. 1, because of obviously my contacts, 2, because of who I am, and 3, to show the sort of, shall we say, the underrepresented side of policing. But the situation was, and I'll lay it on the line, and I won't pull any punches. The problem we have is that the public don't trust the police, particularly the BAME communities. They don't trust the police. And the reason for that is because for years and years and years, because of austerity, we've taken away cops from the front line. So you got no penetration into the communities. And secondly, police leaders, every meeting I used to go to, we know our communities. We know our communities. And I would ask them, what do you know about your communities? What do you know and understand? Well, you're all Asian. I say, hang on a minute, are we? Okay, so tell me the difference between me, my Muslim colleague, my Bengali colleague, and my Hindu colleague. And you know what? They couldn't tell you a thing because they didn't understand the communities. And the problem is that within policing, and I'll come back and address this point that Kelly mentioned earlier, within hierarchies, you've got hierarchies. Now, there's an awful lot of people who do want things to change in policing. However, the problem we've got is a couple of things. One is that hierarchy within hierarchy. You have the good senior officers who are determined to change policing because they're passionate and they recognise that policing has to change. But then you've got those who think, well, if this changes, I'm going to get exposed because my mates have looked after me to get up here. And if I don't suddenly have this protection around me, I'm going to get caught out. And the problem you have is that everybody will sing the song of change because they want to tick the box for the next promotion. Or they want to tick the box to be seen that, Chief, look what I'm doing. However, when I was part of the positive action team and I had all the problem departments within West Midlands Police, I'll give you an example. 2018, I joined in 86. I'd faced racism before in policing. I'd seen it. I've seen misogyny. I've challenged it. People didn't like me. And all those things you spoke about earlier, about the conversations, where people exclude you, all those things have happened to me. You know, I'd go and sit on a table to have breakfast and all the officers would get up and move away. And I remember when I first started in 86, and me and my tutor constable at the time went to sit on a table, and I'm a young kid from a strict Sikh upbringing. I went to sit on the table with my breakfast with my tutor constable, and all the other 8, 9 officers got up and moved away. And I didn't understand what was going on. Yes, I'd seen racism in growing up in Coventry. You know, we'd seen the skinhead movements, everything else. Yeah. And I didn't understand what was going on. And my tutor constable leant over in my ear and said, "You're going to get plenty of that." He said, "Get used to it," because he said, they don't want to sit near you because they don't trust you. And all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, this is like a real shock. So as a consequence, all through my career, you see all these things, you have the conversations, you challenge people. And what Graham's saying there, I think is a fantastic way forward, but these conversations are being had. The problem you have is that you need the buy-in. And if you don't get the buy-in at all levels, you're not going to get the desired change. Now, Dave Thompson at West Midlands Police, since he came in as Deputy Chief Constable, has been doing his damn best to change the culture, but the culture's rotten. 2018, me and 2 other colleagues, we worked on surveillance. We were the victims of a race hate crime. If we took out a device out of the premises, we left it on to charge. If that device hadn't triggered and recorded the 3-hour conversation, 90 minutes of it, comparing us to terrorists, comparing us to sort of very, very distressing, horrible things about our communities. And, you know, one of the lads was a Pakistani officer, 2 of us were Sikh. I was the only one with a turban in that department. You know, nobody would have believed us, the sort of things that go on. And it took us 2 years to get the officer sacked. And it had to go to a judicial review because even the panel at the gross misconduct hearing actually sided on the victim, actually sided with the perpetrators.
Yeah.
And the Police Federation, and we had this conversation very briefly, Liz.
Yeah.
The Police Federation refused to accept that me and my colleagues were victims. They called the perpetrators victims. It wasn't until I blew a gasket at a main meeting and I stood up and I said, this is absolute trash. And I lost it big time. And there was people there from National Federation and they all said to me, yeah, got to watch him.
Suki, thank you for all of that. It's super useful. I'm going to bring in a couple of other sort of people from the chat, just because I've got some questions brewing in my mind. Is Louise around? Louise Erin Dement. I'm sorry if I've said your name incorrectly. Are you able to come on? I'd just like to sort of play something by you. You've been super active in the chat. If you're able to come on.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Louise. Louise, bearing in mind what we've heard from Kelly, what we've heard from Suki about the realities of racism and everything, you know, the toxicity of the culture. We've heard what Graham has sort of outlined as a possible way forward, where you try and frame the narrative with a starting point that is more about support than sort of punishment and guidelines. I wonder if at the moment the sort of I guess the media narrative and perhaps the policy and political one too about police reform and improvement is much more on the punitive side. We need to get tougher, we need to weed out the bad ones, we need to be much stronger on vetting, we need the disciplinary process to work harder. What if Graham is right and actually all of those things won't have the desired effect, and we need to flip it and sort of have a starting position which is, let's start from a position of empathy, let's start from a position of belief and support and sort of work with rather than against. How does that play to you as a person observing from the outside and feeling frustration display. Does it seem like that's just a lot of nonsense?
No, I think it probably comes down to like the basic psychological principle, right, of like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Like I do get how some people might think, oh, that's not enough, that's too gentle. But I think that if we really look at like how our brains work, and I think psychology could be really important here, is that just negative, it won't work. Like I'm not sure necessarily what the right balance would be in terms of like how much kind of positive, encouraging support is best and how much kind of like punishment-based response is best. But I feel like right now the level of like where it is definitely way too far towards the negative side, and there could definitely afford to be more of that positive base there.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks ever so much, Louise. I'm tempted to bring in Gregory Mulligan, and then I'm going to come back to Kelly. Gregory, are you there?
I am, Liz, but I actually can't come on. I've got a kind of caring responsibility.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Nice to hear you. And you've made a good point in the chat, sort of drawing a sort of a comparison to trading floors, and the sort of how that's shifted over the time. Kelly, you wanted to come back in response to what Suki was saying.
Yes, thank you. So I hope I understood this correctly, that Suki said that a conversation was recorded like that conversation was recorded accidentally, where they were, wow. So I ponder on this often, because when I put my complaint in, I knew that I had been treated in a way that was heinous and dangerous, and I was lucky to survive, that other people have died because of positional asphyxia and obviously self-harm, leading to, so I could easily have died. So I put my complaint in, and it was like it worked backwards. So then, because it was investigated, we watched the CCTV and we found out how they were talking about me behind the scenes. So obviously I didn't know they were calling me these names and discussing my body and my underwear, but I knew what they were doing to me in the cell. And so this is like sort of something that has been uncovered accidentally. And then we had this case that was very similar to mine earlier this year with Dr. Duff, who was stripped. And again, it's almost exactly the same as mine. They talked about her body hair, her underwear, said that she smelt. It's all like sexualized dehumanization of women. And again, because she complained, they then went back and saw what they were saying on CCTV, so they got found out. So I often think, how much of this is happening, because I refuse to accept, and this is going back to the bad apples, and I'm one of those people who is using them, using the air quotes, but I don't think that our selection process in this barrel of apples is so accurate and brilliant that we just happen to pick the bad one out every time. So when I put the complaint in, and lo and behold, we picked it out, we were correct, this was a bad apple. No, I think it's because there's loads of bad apples in that barrel, and they just get found out by certain brave and tenacious people, and people who are have the resources to pursue a complaint. When I say resources, I mean like support from friends and those kinds of things. That's not to put people down if they can't do it, because it's incredibly stressful. So I was just like, wow, they got found out because they were recorded accidentally, and how much of this is happening all the time and we're not catching it.
Thanks, Kelly. Graham, can I ask a question? I want to make sure I've done the best I can to understand, to see if I've got the wrong end of the stick here. So when you talk about psychology has a lot of the answers that we need, and I hope this is an okay question to ask. Yeah. It doesn't feel to me like the lion's share, and we can argue whether or not there's enough, the lion's share of what's actually happening inside the police is enough or not enough, but the lion's share of effort that is targeted at the moment at a sort of at a shift in attitudes. Let's talk about misogyny specifically. It doesn't seem to be borrowing a lot from those sorts of psychology principles.
Yeah,
it's a bit more entry level. It's a bit more, let's get people in a room, we're going to share with them some focus groups we've done, we're going to talk a bit about how the things that you should do and the things that you shouldn't do. And actually the audiences for these good, well-intentioned pieces of work, and I'm glad that they're there, would tend to be, oh, we went into the women's group of the Fed and we shared these findings. I'm not sure that the police are sort of thinking about this in a really, okay, we need to be thinking on the, we really need to be sort of pushing ourselves to think of what is the right way to get this fixed in the fastest possible way, as painful as that's going to be. It's a bit more sort of, well, perhaps we'll just do this PowerPoint.
Culture change takes effort, right? It's not something you can just do, with an hour and a half input. The ABLE training that I do in the US, it's a day's, I train trainers to go and do a day's training with cops, right? And we don't talk about misogyny or sexism or racism because that's getting done elsewhere. That's getting done in other programs. What this program does is we focus on the psychology of reducing harm. We make it relevant to all the officers. These harm doers are causing harm to officers, communities, and the organization. And what I mean by psychology is think about the Stanley Milgram experiment from the 1960s, the power of authority, and how 65% of student subjects pressed the XXX button. And someone talked about hierarchies. Hierarchies are not just ranks. There's cliques. Look at the George Floyd case, Derek Chauvin, the 3 police officers who've been convicted this week of failing to intervene in the situation. One of them said, I was told to do crowd control in traffic. So we need to help officers overcome these challenges. John Daly and Bibb Latany looked at the bystander effect in 1968. John Daly and Daniel Batson looked at the power of sensory exclusion. When you're so focused on your job, on doing that task, call to call, are you missing the cues in officers who are struggling, banter that's going on? Are you missing that? And so that's what I mean when you bring the psychology in. You allow officers to what I call stay, keep the blue head, and keep the blue head is stay present. Stay present. Don't panic. Don't run forward and risk risk harm to yourself. Stay present. Stay focused. Right. Okay. There's a problem here. I need to stop my colleague from doing something. I could get them sacked, and I could do that now. And this is what I'm going to do. So we slow things down. We give them a chance to practice dealing with different scenarios, role plays, scenarios, because that's what the evidence says we need to do. Is we need to, I was speaking to one of the creators of the EPIC program, Ethical Policing is Courageous, was one of the first programs post Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And within a year, and that was brought in the back of increased misconduct and a lack of public trust. And within 1 year, they reduced misconduct and built public trust by talking about the work they were doing around active bystandership. So these programs do have the evidence base. We need the courage and the belief in. Someone talked about buying in. We need more than buying. We need belief in this. This can work, and we're doing this to support our communities, to support our officers. And I think that's something I feel really strongly about. We're not doing that just now.
Graham, do you, when you go into, and I know you don't just work with training police, you work with all kinds of different organisations with this stuff. When you go into a police sort of training environment, do you think it works what you do because you're you and you come and you say, okay, so I was a senior police officer for 30 years, so I kind of know what I'm talking about? And does it have to be one of your own to get this stuff through?
It doesn't have to be. We have some psychologists working alongside us to help us through some of the psychology. So we have, I work alongside retired FBI agents, retired law enforcement officers, and I think that there is a credibility there that you can bring. I talk, as bystanders, I can use my mistakes. I was a young 19-year-old boy. Suki, I joined in 1987, so I'm there with you, mate. I had issues, and I probably acquiesced to behaviours, joined in with behaviours, because if I didn't, what was the risk to myself? So I think, there is credibility there, and I think that's important, that we bring in that credibility to be able to talk honestly about these issues. And Emma mentioned something about the blue head. Yeah, Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, and they use that with All Blacks.
Yeah.
Staying present, staying blue.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Graham. Can I bring in Emma J? Hi, Emma. Nice to see you. Let's just
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. What do you make of all this, Emma?
Liz, what do I always make? I'm always learning.
Is it your sense as is it your sense that do you how optimistic do you feel? I really worry genuinely, this is why we're asking this question, that there's a feeling the police are so up against it, so under the cosh, that any attempt to, you know, eradicate behavior that in the immediate term, in the moment, is comforting, however damaging it might be in the longer term, is going to be met with real strong resistance if we don't completely do a sort of 180 and come at it from a position of investment, support, nurturing, mental health, all of that we're just not going to get anywhere. And my worry is, to exactly what Graham just said, that will just take too long, and in the meantime, you know, women are going to die and people are going to experience what Kelly experienced. What do you think?
I think that's a very depressing thought.
Yeah.
And I think that culture change doesn't happen overnight, and that you have to be patient. And I think that you probably need to do a bit of both and make sure that women don't go on dying or experiencing, and you need to call that out, and you need to go and keep on being outrageous. But this is long term, and you can't. I don't think you can be too harsh. I really don't think you can be too harsh, Liz. I really think you've got to be patient on it.
Thanks, Emma. Can I bring in Matt Zancona, please? Is he there? Hi, Matt. Just while we're unmuting Matt, I want to press this political point. What I'm trying to get at is this idea that, and I know you've made an important point about training and the sort of caliber, if you like, of police training and access to support and all of that stuff, skills, resources, the whole bit, very different from other elite organisations, is the point you're making in the chat. But politically, at the moment, it seems like be tough on the police is where the sort of political following winds are, rather than coming out and saying, actually, what we need to do is something different.
I think the politics of all this are very kind of crude, really, because on the one hand, you've got a kind of duff up the police piece, and then on the other, you've got a very strong recoil inside government against anything that smacks of quote unquote wokery.
Yeah.
So the what's actually a very subtle, and we've heard it this evening, a very nuanced, a very long-term issue, gets squeezed between these two things. And it's so I think politics on this is in a very, very poor place. And I don't think it's an accident, actually, that there's a slight sense in this debate of you know, us all being at sea, because I think at the very top, I mean, I think you do need ministerial direction on this. I mean, this is not just about senior police officers. This should be a matter of you know, clear and pressing concern for any Home Secretary, not to mention Prime Minister. And the point I was making was just that I'm always struck. I mean, you know, that one of the things about police and training in these areas, especially, is that it's always done in a very cursory tick box, rushed kind of way that generates more resentment than it does enlightenment, more heat than light. But I'm really struck that elite organizations have a very different way of doing it. So to give an example, not that all training in the Navy SEALs is to do with issues like this, of course.
Yeah.
But typically a Navy SEAL will be on duty for 6 months and then training for 18. So there's a kind of, the assumption is that at every stage of the SEAL's development, there is 3 times as much training to be done than active service. MI6, you know, caused quite a lot of flack for talking about the LGBT consciousness raising it's been doing recently. Now, you know, actually quite right. And of course, you know, in an intelligence agency, you need that because the interaction between people in a organization of huge tension and massive responsibility, all the more important. But the police is one of those organizations where training is sort of treated as a chore, and you know, you have people stuck in stuffy rooms or plonked in front of a YouTube video. It's you know, has been said much more eloquently by lots and lots of people this evening. If you want to shift a culture, you have to really commit to it, and you have to get people's buy-in to the cultural change. It's not enough just to say these are the things you can and can't do. That's important, but to actually change a generational cohort of police officers from where we clearly are, which is hugely unsatisfactory, to where we should be, it's a work of many years, and it's a work of leadership, you know, enhanced training, resources. I mean, these things do not happen overnight. And I think one of the problems of the last few years has been there's been a big growth, not all bad, in what you might call, you know, awareness training, companies that come in, tell people what to think about a particular issue, and then go away. And I don't think that's what we're talking about here. You know, if you want to, it's so much more subtle than that. I mean, one of the other aspects of this, which I think is worth considering, is the fact that the modern workplace is a very informal location. And that informality can disguise the power relations that actually are very much in play. So you know, one of the paradoxes is that because modern workplaces appear more flat and egalitarian, it's easier for people to get away with bullying or, you know, unpleasant banter, or talking about people behind their backs, or covert sexism, racism. Actually, the modern workplace is the perfect setting for those things, which is a real paradox, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Gosh, we're out of time. I feel like what I've done this evening is open more cans of worms and not managed to satisfactorily put a lid on any. I'm noticing people in the chat, B and Anthony Cope, sharing stories with Kelly too. You've all had hideous experiences, so I'm sorry for you all on that. We are getting somewhere. It might not feel like it, but we've given ourselves a year with this, and we are getting somewhere to understanding the sort of mechanics, the elements that go into creating police culture. I want to say a big thank you to Kelly and to Graham, of course, and to everybody who's come on and spoken this evening, Suki and everybody. I've made a number of notes. I think that is definitely worthwhile, myself anyway, doing more reading around the sort of psychological evidence base for different ways of forcing through culture change in hierarchical organizations, particularly male dominated hierarchical organizations, with the goal of understanding, because there are some key phraseology that Graham has used that I think is very instructive. Learned helplessness, for example, that the progression from mistakes to mental health to misconduct, I think, is a very useful rubric for thinking about how you might design a sort of culture change program that hits top, middle and bottom always round. I definitely think, and this really was the start point for this evening, and where I wanted to sort of pick away at a little bit, this idea that language sort of goes into the insignificant box, and that's almost the sort of beginning and end of the problem. It really isn't the insignificant box, because what you're hearing with the way people speak is a sort of behaviour of much more important and bigger things that get baked into very, you know, serious experiences and systems. Thank you very much for your time. We will do another one of these next month. I will reflect a little bit on what I've heard and keep going with all of my conversations with you all. If you have more things that you want to add, I'm constantly talking to people. Contact me, liz@tortoisemedia.com. It can just be a little thing, it can be a big thing. I'm very, very keen to hear from you and other people you may know who might be able to help us to further our work. And by the end of this year, we will produce something coherent, I promise, in audio, probably, to sort of just to explain a little bit more about the journey that we've been on, the way that everybody's contributed. Thank you very much to you all. Have a safe evening, and we'll be back with another ThinkIn tomorrow evening at 6:30. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.